So for tonight's presentation, I'll introduce our presenters and they'll go over terminology and kind of what we mean when we say invasive species, some identification tips for both common and glossy buckthorn variations, native lookalikes that you should be aware of so you're not ripping out native plants that you want, mechanical removal options, chemical removal options. Joshua Allen from NRCS is going to talk about funding options if you're looking for financial support for invasives treatment. We'll tell you about an upcoming field day that you can join us for, and we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Our presenters are myself, Sam Schneski, who's a Windham County Forester with the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, Joshua Allen with the U.S. Natural Resources Conservation Service, Chris Olsen with Longview Forestry, and Peter Van Loan, the lead forester for the Vermont Land Trust.
All right, I'll take it from here. Thanks, Corey. So just basic terminology. When we talk about invasive species, we're talking about non-native species introduced into a new location by human activity, either intentionally or by accident, and are capable of monopolizing resources such as light, nutrients, water, and space. And the important part is to the detriment of native species. These invasive species also have the benefit of not being from the United States, or from our region, so they don't have insects and disease that would probably control their populations in their native habitats. So next slide. And I thought this was interesting. I think I've heard this before, but I just remembered it when I Googled it and was like, why is this thing called buckthorn? So the terminal bud on a common buckthorn looks like you got to use your imagination, but it looks like a buck's hoof with a thorn coming out of the middle. So there's a picture of a buck's hoof just to show you there is some similarity there. So just a fun fact to start us off. Next slide. So there's a lot of words here, but I did want to compare glossy and common buckthorn. There are similarities, but definite differences. In this part of Windham County, we typically see more glossy buckthorn, but it's important to know common buckthorn as well, because it's just as nasty of an invader. So glossy buckthorn has a single or multiple stems and yellow sapwood, where common buckthorn is often multiple stems, and it too has yellow sapwood. The fruits on glossy buckthorn can be bluish and kind of blackish or almost red before they mature to their blue-black color, whereas the fruits on common buckthorn are blackberries in the fall, and they ripen only on female plants. And berries for both common and glossy are viable in the soil for 2 to 3 years. So the branching on glossy buckthorn is alternate, and I'll point this out on the next slide. Oh, I don't even know if I can. I probably can't see my cursor, but you can point it out, Corey. Alternate, and they don't produce a terminal thorn, whereas with common buckthorn, the branches, dead branches act as thorns, and the twigs often end in a stout terminal thorn. And it feels like a thorn. It's not sort of thorny on common buckthorn. It can be sharp, and the branches are often opposite, or what's called sub-opposite, where it's still pretty opposite, but a little off kilter to make it not a true alternate branching. The heights of these shrubs tend to be about the same, and the diameters, 10 inches is a big one. I've heard of folks having even bigger diameter buckthorn, and those are good firewood. The leaves on glossy buckthorn are smooth edged. They're not toothed, and the veins radiate outward from the central midvein to the leaf margin, which is an important distinction between that and common buckthorn, where the veins radiate out and they extend from the stem to the tip of the leaf, and the leaf is egg-shaped. The bark can be very similar at a smaller, less than 2 inches, but when they get a little bigger, the bark can get pretty flaky on common buckthorn. It's similar to native plums and even cherries, like black cherry bark. And then the roots on both these plants can be reddish with yellow fine roots, and the seed is often moved by wildlife, primarily by birds. Next slide, please. So here's glossy buckthorn. Fun little thing to think of when you're looking at a smaller glossy buckthorn stem is that the lenticels appear to be like make a salted pretzel rod appearance on the bark. Here's an example of the red and reddish berry getting bluish to black as it's maturing, and you can see the leaf structure on that twig is definitely alternate. They're not opposite of each other. They're alternate. And the picture below is just a reminder that they don't always come in exactly the same shade of green. So you can have glossy buckthorn that's quite a few different shades of green. Next slide. And common buckthorn, here's an example of a dead twig that's basically just a thorn at this point. A good trick to tell the difference between, I think it's buckthorn and cherry, is to scrape the bark, and you definitely get this kind of yellowish tinge just underneath the bark on a common and glossy buckthorn. You can see a larger stem of the common buckthorn looking kind of flaky like a prune or cherry bark. And then the leaves, here's an example of the leaves being not completely opposite, but sub-opposite. I wish I could zoom in on that. The end two leaves there, you can see they don't line up exactly opposite of each other. So that's what we call sub-opposite. Then you can see where the veins radiate out from the center and go right up to the top. They don't head out to the margins. And the toothed leaves is another difference. And here's what happens when those in the middle where it says weak thorn and has the berries, when that picture of the terminal bud, when those buds open up and turn into twigs, that's what happens, you know. So they have the two twigs and a thorn in the middle of the buck hoof, per se, the comparison from the beginning. And I think we'll turn it over to Peter at this point. Is that the next slide?
Sounds good. Thanks, Sam. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I am joining you from a rural internet connection. So if this gets sketchy, let me know, and I may turn my video off so that at least the audio will work well. So one thing we want to make sure of when we're out controlling invasives is that we are actually controlling the invasive and not something that we'd like to leave behind. So a few of the most common native lookalikes are shown here. Starting from the left, speckled alder looks fairly similar to the common buckthorn in terms of it also has a toothed edge, but you can see that those veins are really straight. They go out to the edge. So that's one that if you look at the bark, they can be fairly similar, but if you check the leaf, it's fairly easy to tell apart. Silky dogwood has those curved, the center one there has those curved veins that sort of work their way up towards the tip of the leaf. But the thing is on those is they are opposite branched, and they're as you can see there, their fruits are sort of in a cluster that extend out from the branch, as opposed to the common buckthorn, where the fruits are on fairly small, short little stems right next to the branch. Alternate leaf dogwood, again, has those curved veins similar to glossy buckthorn and common. But the thing about them is they have this kind of unique leaf structure where at the ends of the of the branch, there's a whole collection of leaves that sort of radiate out from one spot. And you definitely don't get that in glossy buckthorn. One that's really common and hard to tell apart for some folks is chokecherry, shown at the bottom. It is similar to the common buckthorn in that the leaf shape is fairly similar, and they also have a toothed edge. They have more veins. The common buckthorn has 3 to 5 pairs of veins. This has many more, and as Sam pointed out, the common ones go up towards the tip of the leaf. These ones on the chokecherry go sort of straight out towards the edge of the leaf. And again, you've got a cluster of berries out at the end, sort of dangling off, as opposed to having the berries close in by the tip. The next slide, we'll look at the bark of these. So you've got the common buckthorn on the far left, and a younger version of the one that Sam showed. Black cherry in the middle, with glossy buckthorn on the right and speckled alder furthest to the right. I guess one thing that was kind of interesting, I heard someone describe these. So the little white spots on there are called lenticels. And a lot of like cherries and birches and this speckled alder, the lenticels are sort of look like maybe Morse code. There's long dashes and there's a few dots and that sort of thing, whereas glossy buckthorn sort of looks like Braille. It's little dots and dashes all put together in a clump. And I found that to be pretty helpful. It's pretty easy to tell them apart when you think of it that way. And we'll go on to the next slide and just talk a little bit about how invasives work. When they're first introduced, there aren't very many around, so they don't sort of blend in. They don't really show up. Once you start to see them, there's a fair number of plants there, and it's kind of time to get going. That's the point at which you'll actually be able to do some control. If you get further beyond that, it gets much harder and much more expensive to control them. And so the first, I'm going to talk about non-chemical control modes. And the first ones I'm going to talk about are those that are more effective sort of early in the invasion curve. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about another thing that's really important when you're trying to figure out how to control this thing, and that is to really understand how the plant grows and at what point in the year it's doing different things, the so-called phenology of the plant. First of all, just a note up at the top there, that YouTube link is to a webinar that was done last fall. Chris Olsen was part of that as well. And that's really great. It's non-chemical control of invasive plants. So if you want to go into a lot more detail about how these things work and when it's appropriate to do them and when it's not, I suggest you go to that YouTube recording of the webinar. You can find it at the VLT, Vermont Land Trust YouTube account. And I think Corey just put in a link in the chat where you can get it at the Natural Resource Conservation District site as well. So getting back to the phenology, it's really important to know when it's leafing, when it is leafing out, when it's flowering, when it's setting seed, because then you can use that information to inform when is the best time to do your various control methods. And we'll get into that a little bit in the next few slides. So the first one that we're going to talk about, you can go to the next one, Corey, is pulling, which is sort of the most common one for buckthorn. A lot of people, it's the first thing they think of. And you know, it's really simple. If you have only a few, if you're sort of at the leading edge of that wave of invasives infestation, it can be quite effective, but it really kind of has to be on a fairly small area. So if you have, I don't know, what your tolerance is, but if you have an acre of a fairly heavy infestation or a larger area that's really light, maybe only a few plants per acre, and you're just walking around pulling them, that can be fairly effective. Sam there on the left pulling some seedlings that are pretty small. That kind of thing is pretty easy to do. It's when you're pulling them, when you're hand pulling, it's best to do it like now, this time of year, especially this year, when the soil is wet, because the roots don't have as good a hold on the soil. So stuff comes out much more easily that way. If you have bigger stuff that's maybe an inch or two in diameter, you're probably not going to pull that out by hand. So there's this cool thing called a weed wrench. There are a few pictures of it there. It has a jaw that closes around the stem, and then as shown in the drawing there, you sort of lean back on that and it pivots on the foot and uses that leverage to pull it up by the roots. So some of the disadvantages, or one of the disadvantages of this kind of thing, is that it does result in some ground disturbance. So if you are pulling plants or using a weed wrench, if there's a lot of leaf litter or something, you can try to, if it's not a big area, you can try to cover over that, so there isn't quite as good a seed bed for seeds to get started. One of the other things about the weed wrench that's difficult is it's fairly heavy, but if you're using it in your backyard, it's not too bad carrying it around. And another good thing about it is Sam has one in his office, and if you want it, you want to borrow it and see how you like it, see how it works, give him a call and sign it out.
Yep, I don't want to see that thing sitting on the office floor very much. It should be
That's
out,
right.
being used.
So the next slide, we'll talk about mowing and cutting and browsing, which is sort of the same thing, right? You're trying to take those plants and cut them down. It can be a really, and again, there's that link to the YouTube recording from last fall, because I really think that's a really great resource for folks. And we will be doing a follow-up email that'll send some of these links to you. So if you don't get it written down, you'll get it later. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about some of the advantages and disadvantages of these things. So one thing is you make a lot of progress fast. It's not that you've controlled them, but you have definitely made progress. And that's no small thing. I find that when you're doing invasive plant work, you're going out there and you're working hard every day and you don't really see progress. It gets pretty defeating after a while. You just sort of wonder when it's ever going to end. Something like this, you actually see a difference pretty fast. So it's a good way to take a fairly large area and knock it back and make it look fairly decent and start to make you feel a little bit more hopeful about the place. You will have to follow up. You'll have to do some sort of a repeated treatment, because both of these will sprout pretty vigorously once they're cut. So you can't just cut it and be done. You're going to have to do some sort of follow-up treatment. Whether it's mowing it again or trying to smother it or doing chemical treatment, you're going to have to do something to try to keep it from coming back as vigorously or more vigorously than before. Another sort of disadvantage or advantage of this is if you do it at the right time. So again, getting back to the phenology, if you do this after it's flushed all its leaves and maybe it's even started to flower a little bit, it's put all its root reserves into that. And once you cut it, it doesn't have as many reserves to flush again. So if you're going to mow it and do repeated mowings, you time that first one before it's flowered or just as it's flowering, definitely before seed. You don't want to mow after seed. that's a great time to do it because you weaken the plant significantly. Wait a couple of months and it'll come back, mow it again, or wait it and do a chemical application or other treatment. But again, the timing is important for that. And one of the disadvantages of these is that they're not terribly selective generally. I mean, a really talented operator with a big mulching mower can definitely move around larger things like dogwoods and other native shrubs that you want to leave. And if you're careful with a brush saw, you can avoid those. It does get kind of hard if you have a really dense infestation of buckthorn to avoid that one little dogwood that's growing up in the middle of them. And if you're doing browsing, generally with goats, it's going to be pretty hard, if not impossible, to keep them from just eating everything. So you just have to make that decision as to whether that's okay. And the last slide, I think, is the next one, Corey. Yeah, so smothering is another thing you can do, and this is generally only going to be effective if you have a few. But again, if you're at sort of the leading edge of that infestation or that invasive wave, this could work for you. And so essentially what you do is you cut it down very low to the ground, maybe leave a couple inches of stem there, and then you cover it with this thing called a buckthorn baggie, which you can see between Sam and Jack there, which is just a really heavy duty plastic bag, and you take a zip tie and you put it around the base, and that keeps or kills any of the root suckers that would try to sprout after that's cut. You can also use a tin can. If you've got enough tin cans around, just cut the stem off and then screw the can to the stump. We do have some buckthorn baggies that CISMA does. I think Corey's, I guess I still have them. I haven't transferred them to Corey, but maybe this weekend we're doing an in-person event, so we'll bring those along if folks want to come to that and grab a baggie or two to take home and try out. They can do that. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk about chemical control. And while we change over sharing screens, if there are a couple of questions in the chat, Corey, we could probably address those.
Yeah, someone asked if you cut it every year, will it ever die out?
It probably won't die out. If you do it a few times a year, you probably will be able to control it. The key is to make sure that when you're mowing it, you don't allow it to get to where it's producing seed. Annual mowing will keep it sort of at bay, but it likely won't kill it.
And then Chris, if you want to jump in.
Sure. I suppose quickly, Karen just asked, can you use regular grocery store bag instead of a buckthorn baggie?
I think that probably wouldn't work. They're not heavy duty enough. They're likely to fall apart. The other thing about the buckthorn baggie is that it's really dense. I don't know if it makes a difference that it's black and so it's not letting any sunlight in, because if something does actually manage to sprout in there, it won't be able to photosynthesize. But I think they probably would not work. They're not heavy enough.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Olsen. I work with Longview Forest and Contracting on the Woodland Services crew, and we do a fair bit of chemical invasive control work over the summer. A lot of is Joshua will talk in after, and there's had time today together a slideshow for you, but unfortunately I just have to talk through things. If we think back to Peter's slide about phenology, we can really most optimize chemical treatments while leaves are on the plant, while it still has foliage. And as you all have probably seen, foliage is starting to turn. So we are kind of in crunch time at work, and I've been putting in a lot of hours. So I'm sorry I don't have a slideshow for you. So chemical treatments are a possibility. There are a number of methods that you can use, but the big takeaway that I want to try to get across for you right now is with great power comes great responsibility. Chemical control of plants can have very impressive and sometimes very unintended consequences if you don't know what you're doing. So in that spirit, because there are so many variables, I'm just going to say at the outset that I'm not going to be giving any specific recommendations or formulations for what you should use. All of that information can be found on individual herbicide labels, and I highly recommend consulting a professional, whether that be the company that I work for, myself, or there are many of us who do this type of work. But I strongly discourage coming up with your own cocktails and mixtures. So that being said, within the chemical application of herbicide, there is a fact of life, which is the label is the law. Whatever the herbicide label says, that has the weight of law. I don't know if you've all seen before, like, it is a violation of federal law to use this product inconsistent with its labeling. That's essentially what they're getting at. If you are using active ingredient in excess of application rate on the label, you're in violation of the law. Herbicide labels can be a little confusing and intimidating. So I don't want to throw this all out there to be scary, but I do want to say there's a tremendous level of responsibility that comes along with chemical applications. One of the principles that I want to introduce, there's some vocabulary I'd like to get out of the way. One is mode of action, and that's actually what the herbicide is doing to the plant. And that's typically the active ingredient doing that mode of action. So generally in herbicide treatments, we're working with glyphosate, the most of glyphosate, and controversy and interest information, a lot of side own interests. I don't want to that, but glyphosate it's a primary triclopyr. So mode of action is interrupting the of the plant to create energy for itself, and it therefore dies. Triclopyr, the mode of action is to essentially completely dysregulate the hormonal balance of the plant, so it grows too fast and it outgrows its energy reserve and then dies. So that's sort of the more common formulations. We get into another principle, which is surfactants, and that is how the chemical actually enters the plant. That's the most critical piece that a lot of people don't understand. If you just go to Agway and you buy Roundup off the shelf, and there's a bunch of different formulations of Roundup, it's probably not going to kill the target species, because a lot, especially buckthorn here that we're talking about, is a woody plant. And the surfactants in off-the-shelf Roundup typically cannot penetrate the leaf cuticle of woody plants. And therefore, you're just spraying glyphosate and it's not going to be effective. With Longview, we use a couple specific surfactants. There's then concentration of active ingredient. So not all of the herbicide is the active ingredient. And all of this is a function of surface area. So if you're like drenching the plant, you need a much lower concentration. If you are doing cut stump, on here it's called cut surface herbicide treatment, you generally use a much higher concentration of herbicide. So in fact, while you're targeting specific plants with cut surface herbicide and getting a lot more laser precision, you're generally using a significantly greater amount of active ingredient. So that's just a thing to weigh. I understand that some people have concern, with good reason, about just spraying things out into the atmosphere. But there is a constant concern that comes up in using herbicide treatments. And another chemical we be treating plants. We don't want to just go mow a bunch of plants and then the moment that new leaves come out, we spray those, because we have a really disproportionate amount of leaf surface area to root surface or root mass. And so you're probably not going to get the balance right, and you might just damage the plant. And then we get into topics of herbicide resistance, which is a little scary. So that's really the big principles that I wanted to cover here. It seems like my audio is skipping. I'm sorry about that. I usually have decent internet connection, but yeah, that's really all I've got. Herbicide can be beneficial. It can be very helpful on large areas or for very serious infestations, but it also requires a lot of knowledge and thought and responsibility. So if you have questions, please ask. Getting a pesticide applicator license is not necessarily required if you're treating your own property, but it is helpful and very informative. And the state of Vermont is very helpful in answering questions. And if you have questions, please reach out to professionals. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And next, Joshua Allen from the Natural Resources Conservation Service is going to talk a little bit about the process of applying for and getting funding to do some of what Chris just talked about on your property with a professional.
Thank you, Corey. Give me just 1 second. Can you all see my screen? Wonderful. So as Corey stated, my name is Joshua Allen, or Josh Allen. I'm a soil conservationist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And this presentation is the Landowner's Guide to NRCS programs. So for those who have worked with NRCS before, this may just be a refresher. But for those who are interested in and would like to be new applicants, this would be some really good beneficial information that could help with funding and cost assistance opportunities going forward. So first we have, let's make this a bit smaller, shall we? Excellent. So accepting conservation technical assistance requests. CTA request forms or NRCS applications can be accepted year-round and processed within the established funding period of that particular fiscal year. So just some examples of that. The fiscal year is from October 1 to September 30th of each year. So we're actually coming to the end of fiscal year 2021 and going to start fiscal year 2022. So this is a good time for folks who are interested in applying for some assistance to give us a call. We can start scheduling some site visits, but we'll get into that, later on down the line with this presentation, so you understand the process. But the application can be accepted year-round, and we'll just process it depending on what program you're applying for within that particular funding period. And acceptable application submissions, you can hand deliver it, depending on what office and how they operate with COVID restrictions and things like that. You can fax it in if that office has a fax machine. I will say the Brattleboro office does not, at least not one that I've seen. You can USPS mail it in, you can scan and email it to the field office, or there is an electronic option. It's called OneSpan. It's not through farmers.gov, it's actually separate, but all we would need is your mobile number, and it has to be a mobile number, it can't be a landline, and an email, and that way we can set you up with a profile. So if you're interested in pursuing an application within NRCS, you can submit an application, view the process as things are being ranked and assessed. If your application is selected for funding, you can follow that process as well. So it makes things a bit more fluid. So before we can actually get out on your property and actually start, working through some of the resource concerns or concerns you may have on your property, we have to establish some eligibility, and it has to be established through the Farm Service Agency, or FSA. And I'll go through some of the required documents pretty quick. So first being the AD 1026 highly erodible land form. So this form stemmed from the Dust Bowl from the 30s. Essentially, it's determining if your property is highly erodible or not. And then if it is, the premise of the form is to say that you will not be implementing any practices or any types of dealings on your property that would encourage erosion. Next is the 1199A direct deposit form, and that's pretty forward. It's a direct deposit form. And I will say this form isn't necessarily as applicable at the time of application, but it is important if your application is selected for funding, because it's going to be an integral piece moving you forward from pre-approval to approval and obligation. Next, we go to the CCC 902 farm operating plan for an individual. And this form is just used to identify signature authority, if it's an entity or if it's a husband and wife, if who are children or whoever it is who has the authority to sign for the contract documents or the application documents, what have you. And also just general information about the individual or the entity. The CCC 941 average adjusted gross income form. This form is used to assess an applicant's income, and to qualify, a producer or an entity must gross less than $900,000. And that is a lot, it is, but you must gross less than $900,000 averaged over 3 years, and it's going to be confirmed by the IRS. And then lastly is to establish control of the land. So we would need either a copy of the deed if you own your property, or a copy of your lease if you're leasing from someone, or some type of agreement that states that you manage and control that particular piece of property that you are applying for conservation assistance for. So we're going to go over 3 of NRCS's more popular programs. There are more programs out there in the ether, but these are the 3 that tend to be more applicable, specifically in New England. So first being the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. You may have heard EQIP around. Next is the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. And then lastly, we'll have the Agricultural Management Assessment Program, or AMA. So first, EQIP. So through EQIP, NRCS provides producers or landowners, because I will say most of the language seems to be centered around having farmland, and that may not be the case. So I will say producers or landowners with one-on-one help to target specific resource concerns on their property, and financial assistance to plan and implement improvements, or what NRCS calls conservation practices. So NRCS will work with you to develop a conservation plan that meets your goals and your vision while conserving natural resources. And NRCS offers about 200 unique practices designed for working farms, ranches, forests, and pastures. But I will say, take this number 200 with a grain of salt, because there are practices that are more applicable to areas than other practices. And not to say that it's not available, but the technical specialist has to be available to provide that, assistance and assessment and things like that. So, some things are more applicable, but if we're talking about forestry and brush management, controlling invasives, that's definitely a practice that NRCS provides assistance for. And then NRCS financial assistance can cover part of the costs. And I would say, in my experience, I've been working with the agency for about 6 years now, and usually it's about 75 to maybe about 85% cost share for implementing some of these practices. So that's I would say better than nothing, for sure. So next we'll go into the conservation stewardship program. So just to delineate the two, EQIP is more of a targeted program. You have these specific concerns like invasive control, or you are concerned about wildlife and you want to open up some areas. So you may be concerned about a patch cut, or you're concerned about crop or mass tree releasing and things like that. So if you have these specific concerns on your property, EQIP, or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, may be your best bet to control that specifically. Where the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP, it looks at the full scope of your property, and it addresses various resource concerns. So it could be soil quality, erosion, water quality, air quality, your plant resources, wildlife resources or livestock resources, energy. It could cover, I think it's about 11 or 12 resource concerns, or delineated resource concerns established by NRCS, or recognized by NRCS. So CSP provides two possible ways of payment through a 5-year contract. So first being annual payments. So annual payments are your payments for having your property in this program, essentially. So you can think of CSP of, well, I guess we're going to go back to comparing the two between EQIP and CSP. So for EQIP, think of it as your first car. It's just to kind of get the job done, just kind of get you from point A to point B to point C, where you need to get, and kind of take care of what your immediate concerns are. And you can consider CSP as, you've reached the Cadillac status. You've met your concerns, you have gotten a good grasp on your property, and this is to incentivize you to continue your efforts, and then encourage you to adopt maybe 1 or 2 more enhancements to exceed that threshold. So I would say CSP is a program for folks who have done the due diligence or worked with NRCS before. You've controlled and maintained some of these invasive issues or forest issues, and now it's just to encourage you to continue to do that, so you get payments to continue to do what you've been doing, and then adopt maybe 1 or 2 enhancements or practices that will take you a bit above and beyond your stewardship of the land. And the second payment is supplemental payments for meeting specific resource concern thresholds at the time of your application. So we'll go into threshold eligibility, in this next section. So to be eligible for this program, you have to meet at least 2 priority resource concerns at the time of application. So let's say if there are 9 resource concerns for forestry total, and there are about 5 priority resource concerns, you have to meet at least 2 of those priorities to be eligible for CSP. And then you must agree to meet or exceed the threshold of at least 1 additional priority resource concern by the end of the contract. So that would be agreeing to, install an enhancement or a practice that's going to take you, like I said, above and beyond your stewardship of the land. And then next or lastly, we'll go into the Agricultural Management Assessment Program, or AMA. Now this program is more geared toward managing risk. So NRCS administers NRCS conservation provisions. So we will, provide the plan, do the resource concern inventory, site visits, things of that nature, while the Agricultural Marketing Service and the Risk Management Agency implement other provisions, like providing the funding, and making sure that the practices being installed are actually going to manage that risk on that property. So Program participants may develop or improve the following: sources of irrigation water, recognizing irrigation delivery systems and improving those, protecting crop productivity, and some incentive payments are available to encourage producers to adopt irrigation water management. So this program is more so geared toward assessing risk for sure, and generally crop production. So for people who have forest land and maybe doing some gardening and things like that, or even actual farming throughout their forests, this may be another acceptable program that could work in hand or in conjunction with CSP or EQIP. But I will say within this program, persons or legal entities cannot receive more than $50,000 within a fiscal year. So between October 1 and September 30th. And then it's most of New England and the East Coast and a few, like Hawaii and things like that, that this program is applicable to. So we're going to go into assessments and rankings. So conservation planners will plan site visits with the technical specialists. Let's say if we need the wildlife biologist out there, or we need, the county forester, or we need, wildlife partners, things of that nature. We'll collaborate with those partners. We'll collaborate with you as the producer. And if you are able to have your contractor on site as well, that'd be even better, so we can all have different vantage points from different eyes looking at the problems, and maybe look at some subsequent problems that may be happening that may not have registered. And then some projects require multiple site visits, depends on the complexity of the practice itself, or maybe the size of the area of interest or the size of your property. It could take multiple visits. But planners will assess applications based on the following to receive a ranking score. Your resource concerns that we identify on your property. So if we're talking forestry, a resource concern could be plant productivity. It could be structure and composition of the plants that you desire to have on your property. It could be wildlife influences. It could be erosion. It could be different things, different concerns that you have on your property. A resource inventory. So once we identify the actual concerns, we have different questions that populate based on those concerns, and we will answer those questions based off of what we've seen on your property. And then different questions that we may have to ask you specifically, just to kind of get a grasp of what we're dealing with. Another aspect is existing practices and historical practices. We're taking into account the planned practices, so whatever we are planning that will mitigate these concerns that we've identified, and then state-generated ranking questions, as well as geospatial information. And then ranking deadlines, just like application deadlines, it's deadlines all through the calendar. I have sticky notes all through my office. But usually the ranking deadlines are applicable to different programs, so they can be pretty variant throughout the process. But the point of being a conservation planner is to make sure we keep a good flow of communication, so you're aware of deadlines and things like that, so you have ample time to pivot and make sure that you can have ducks in a row, so we can have a very fluid process. Then the state office staff usually begins selecting applications based on ranking scores within funding pools. So to better spread the funding around, there are funding pools for specific areas of mitigation. So there's funding pools, let's say, for example, for high tunnels, for farmsteads, forestry and wildlife, things of that nature. So let's say hypothetically you submit an application and we go through the ranking process and your application is selected for pre-approval. Applicants within any program should not, and I say should not commence any practice until contacted by their planner and have received word that their contract is obligated. Obligated is definitely going to be the key word there. So even if you hear that your application is approved, it may be approved, but it's not obligated. Obligated means the money is actually in place and you are able to commence that practice with the standards and specifications to guide you along. During the pre-approval process, applicants are given the opportunity to accept or decline the opportunity. And then we will also review and go through contract appendix so you understand payments and if you want to cancel or if modifications are needed or if the contract is out of compliance. Once fully obligated, a participant has 12 months from obligation to start that practice. And if you do need assistance, feel free to call your conservation planner. And it's a responsibility of the participant to connect with the contractor and ensure that the project meets NRCS's standards and specifications. So think of your contract with NRCS as separate from your contract with your contractor to have forest work done. Essentially, your contract with NRCS is to support that contract, but we in no way influence that, but we do set the standards and specifications as plainly as possible so you and your contractor understand how work needs to be done in order to receive payment. So we're going to go speaking about payments and certifications. So with EQIP and AMA, completed practices can be certified and paid upon meeting NRCS standards and specifications. So let's say if your contract was obligated at the beginning of August and you complete your practice in November of that same year, we can go out, make a site visit, plan a site visit, certify that practice, make sure it meets standards and specifications, and start the payment process for those, EQIP and AMA programs. For CSP, the payments are a bit different. They're made annually, and they include your land use payment, your resource concern payment, anything that you have completed in that year will be encompassed in that payment. And there are 2 windows for payment as it relates to CSP. It's usually the start of the fiscal year. So between October, I would say maybe 5th to, I'll say about Thanksgiving, so the end of November. And then the beginning of January to about the end of February is the 2 windows for CSP payments. Participants are responsible for paying income tax on NRCS payments. They are taxable income. And by law, you must report any payments you receive from NRCS as taxable income when filing your income tax. And this also applies to payments that are assigned to contractors or other entities. Even though those payments are going to someone else, the contract holder is still responsible for the taxes. You need to consider, this is just something internal, but consider how it would impact your taxes. And I guess this would be more so for a CSP, for folks who may be receiving CSP payments, and they're pretty large payments if your property is pretty large. So it depends on how you want to work your taxes. You have those 2 windows to work tax-wise to make sure you won't get taxed at least too much in that particular year, essentially. And this last slide is just the Brattleboro field office information. So for the Brattleboro field office, I am the sole soil conservationist. So if my contact information is there. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to give me a buzz and we can work through it. And I will say, since the fiscal year is starting very soon, we can set something up in this coming fall potentially, and hopefully have your application rolling for this coming spring, and maybe have some work done next fall. But that's it.
Thanks, Josh. Cool. Hopefully you can see my screen. Cool. So this Saturday, we have a field day scheduled from 1:30 to 3:30, and that's going to take place at Vermont Land Trust's McCulloch property, which is located at 89 Meadowbrook Road. It's kind of conveniently located just past where the old 7-Eleven used to be. Meadowbrook goes to the north off of Route 9. And we'll have an opportunity for you to kind of see some examples of common invasives in the field and see some examples of where different treatment methods have been employed and kind of see how effective those methods have been. And just a chance to ask questions of the folks that you've seen on this webinar here in person. We do ask that you email windhamcountynrcd@gmail.com to RSVP for that, just so we have a sense of how many people are coming and we can plan for it. There is also a follow-up survey that you can take online and let us know what you thought of the program and if you have feedback for future programs or suggestions. And I'll put that link into the chat box in a moment. And then finally, we have time for questions from the group. All of our contact info is here if you like to reach out to somebody after this program is ended. I know there were a few questions in the chat box that we hadn't got to yet. Somebody asked, what time of year can you cut full-grown buckthorn so there are no berries to fall on ground when you remove trees?
You're gonna probably want to cut those by early July anyway. They usually are flowering in June into July and start to set seed after that. Probably best to get it done by the end of June. One thing to think about, if you have a bunch, well, I guess even if you don't have a bunch, but if you are out there cutting buckthorn clumps or saplings in June, just have a look to see if there's a bird nest in there. Cut it down. Good
point. And then another question, how do chemicals travel underground and how long do they, I think, last?
That varies based on the herbicide in question. One of the primary reasons that glyphosate has sort of grown in popularity is because it has very, very little and very brief soil activity. I was trying to look up the label to get a specific number on that, but I wasn't able to find that quickly. The short answer is yes, but it tends not to travel or be especially persistent with glyphosate. Triclopyr is a little bit longer, but generally speaking, especially with cut stem treatments, that herbicide is still confined to the interior of the plant and thus breaks down more slowly, or less is released into the soil, and it takes place over a longer period of time.
Thanks, Chris. Another question, we have a significant buckthorn problem, much of which is located in or near a jurisdictional wetland. What should I be aware of in doing buckthorn treatments, especially chemical ones, given that?
I would say make sure that whatever chemical treatments are happening are using wetland approved herbicides and are also using surfactants that are non-ionic, as they are less likely to harm amphibians. But as for jurisdictional wetland, I'm a little unclear on that phrasing. I'm wondering if maybe this participant is in New Hampshire. I'm not sure.
Wetlands in Vermont, I think, are by definition jurisdictional, which means the state has authority to say what you can and can't do in them.
I see.
That's how it's been explained to me by Vermont DEC wetland staff.
Great. Yeah, I have generally only worked on projects where all of that has already been taken care of, typically through the NRCS process, so I can't speak to that personally.
I guess one thing that I would add to that, just listening to Chris talk about getting the right surfactant and the right herbicide to use in that, I would say if you have a situation like that, the first thing I would do is call a professional and quote from them, because they're going to know exactly the right thing to use there to be very sensitive to that wetland and make sure that there isn't damage to it. So that's where I would go.
And when in doubt, when dealing with a wetland, you can request a consultation from one of DEC's wetland ecologists. Rebecca Chalmers is the one for this region in the state, and that would be free of charge. They would be willing to at least look at your property from a satellite image, and if they look at that and think it requires more attention, they would come out and visit it with you and could give you a for sure answer about what you can and can't do to be compliant and also protect that, because wetlands are important. Next question. Somebody asks, can you talk about girdling?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I was going to talk about it. And Chris, if you have experience with this, I'd love to hear it too. I think Sam had some interactions with a landowner in Putney who did a fair bit of this. The one thing I know about girdling is that it's not that dissimilar from cutting. So if you do girdle buckthorn, it is going to resprout from the base, just like if you, so you're still going to have to do something else, kill it, generally speaking. Maybe that's you go out there every year and you snip off or knock off in some way all the little sprouts that pop up around the base. It will definitely slowly kill that particular plant, but it's unlikely to kill the entire plant so that it doesn't come back. Chris or Sam, do you have things to add?
In a timber stand improvement sort of setting, when we're talking about actual like native trees, I would say girdling is a whole different story, and I think it's great. But for buckthorn specifically or invasives, it's a tremendous amount more work, and it doesn't do anything differently than would completely severing the stem.
Another question, somebody asks if there's a list of contractors who will assess and estimate cost of removal, and are they overwhelmed?
I can't speak to whether they're overwhelmed or not. Maybe Chris can. They probably are at this time of year. But I believe the Agency of Agriculture keeps a list of certified applicators. It's a little hard to sort through because everybody who's certified to apply herbicides or any kind of pesticide. Chris, maybe you know better if there's an actual list. Sam and I are both fairly familiar with the companies that offer this service in the area, so you can contact one of us and we can try to help you out.
Yeah, unless the SISMA or any of you guys specifically have a list, I'm not aware of one that exists. As for the overwhelmed portion of the question, we are right now trying to work through the last of our the contracts that we have going. So this time of year, usually, yes, we're pretty overwhelmed. But I would say reaching out to contractors to get them to look at things after the leaves have fallen is usually fine. I would say the season's anticipating actual foliar treatment season is a good time to get in contact with us so we can start to get a schedule together, especially if it's NRCS. That's really critical. Don't wait until you're getting close to the deadline, because that complicates things.
Are there other questions out there? You can either put them in the chat box or you can just unmute yourself and ask your questions. I know it is a few minutes after 8 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Please feel free to reach out to any of the contacts that you see here on the screen if you have questions. Also remember to RSVP for this Saturday's field day by emailing the Conservation District to sign up for that. And there will also be a follow-up email that will come out hopefully tomorrow that will have a link to the recording and some of the materials that were mentioned during tonight's program.
Thank you all for spending a little time with us tonight to learn about buckthorn, and let us know
Thank
if
you.
we can help you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Corey.